this. There we go. Hello, sorry for the delay. I'm Glenn Fleishman. I'm the author of How Comics Were Made, a project that went live this morning on Kickstarter, and you can ask questions in this video so I can find out what's going on here. Oh, this is marked. Let me see if I can fix this. I think it's marked as a private video, and it should not be private since it went live. I don't see comments being available yet. Hold on 1 second and it will be public. And there we go. Whoops, public. And that should make a difference. Now you can ask questions. You can always, there we go. Now the chat is live. Sorry about that. So the book is about the history of newspaper cartooning told through printing artifacts and artists' drawings and conversations with artists, visits to museums, looking at newspaper printing itself, doing historical research. The idea is to tell a rich picture about what the whole nature of newspaper cartooning and reproduction is. So what I'm trying to do is use artifacts to tell stories that haven't been told before, because these artifacts haven't been seen. So there's things like printing plates and in some cases original artwork you may have seen or have had access to, or gone to museums, seen exhibitions, maybe even own a piece of original cartooning art. But the idea is that you can see in this book the entire process. So it's everything from the creation of the work by an artist at their drawing board, a lonely craft, but one that's been going on for 130 years. In very similar form. I was just visiting an artist, Brian Bassett, the other day, and he sits there in his office, in his studio, at an artboard and is drawing away, and that's how the strip gets made. So it's a very consistent art form in many ways, even if some people are using styli now instead of pens or using different media. But it's one that has this rich history, and it's been told in a lot of different ways. A lot of times the history of cartooning is told, of newspaper cartooning, is told in terms of the biography of the artist, the story that's being told, the historical context, the nature of the business. And I think those, it's not that you can't find good stories like that. There's tons of them, right? It's that I think those stories have been told. And so as I came across printing artifacts and material that was kind of around cartooning, I thought, here's a lot of rich, interesting material that no one's ever seen. And so how do I tell a story that is fresh and unique and has is compelling to look at? And the stories about the people involved are compelling, but it tells you about a process. It tells you why printing shaped cartooning, because cartooning fundamentally exists in newspapers and then later in other media in different ways because of the specific nature of printing itself. There are aspects to printing both in the metal days before we had this new flat method. So for the first 500 years of printing or so, all printing was done just about with a relief metal, with raised metal, with ink placed on it, pushed into paper. And then we switched to this flat method, this offset lithographic method, which uses ink repelling and ink attracting areas of a flat plate. And but all of that is kind of about positive or binary choices. It's black or it's not black. It's yellow or it's not yellow. And so cartooning, the fundamental unit of cartooning is a line, and a line reproduces really well. And then you add tints, and there's more that can be done as you add tints, layer different colors, pull it all together. And so what my book is trying to, this is the book that I hope you'll back. You can see up there, I've got the URL. You can find the Kickstarter campaign by following that link. What my project is trying to do is in book form explain processes that are confusing and archaic, and sometimes that's a process from how things were printed in 1897, say. Other times it's things that are happening today. How does a cartoonist work? Some cartoonists I've spoken to, and I've interviewed nearly 40 people for this so far, and plan to do more as the book progresses towards completion in the next few months. Some artists are working in traditional media, in watercolor and pen and ink, in other kinds of like brush-based inks or material, and then they typically scan it. They don't send it to the syndicate anymore. It's a long time gone. And then the syndicate will color the strips. Most daily strips are now colored, but they're colored digitally for newspapers running color during the day. And so, how does that work? What's all the steps involved? And I really wanted to get the artist's hand involved in this and talk about this entirely from the standpoint of how artists work. Their methods are the thing that's important. Like the line they make is important, and then how it's reproduced to that final process. Please do ask questions in the comments if you're watching live, or if you're later watching this video, you can ask comments or post comments, and I will answer those when those come in. Jacob Forb, hello Jacob, asks, might the book contain or use any comic printing methods or papers itself? Not in the current planning. It's just getting a book printed in 2024 is an expensive and complicated thing, and adding additional media will be quite tricky. Now, I do have some higher tier rewards on the campaign that includes, the one is a print of Bill Griffith Zippy the Pinhead print that he's authorized letting us do. I'm working with a letterpress printer, Jessica Spring, on that. And then there's some historic Peanuts flongs or printing molds for 4-color Sunday panels. But right now, that's the only thing. I didn't set stretch goals on this campaign because I thought the book is the fundamental unit. But if it does well in crowdfunding, it's possible I could add additional elements over time. But I'm fundamentally focused on doing the book as the book and showing through reproduction, so scans of newsprint pages, scans of things, what material look like rather than printing on the material itself. But it's a great idea, Jacob. And at one point I'd kicked around whether I could print, there's a company in the United Kingdom that uses spare capacity at newspapers to print newspapers for you, and you can get literally one copy of a paper printed, or 1,000 or 10,000. It's relatively affordable. The shipping is very cheap because it's lightweight, and I thought that might be an add-on for this project. I felt like it added too much complexity, took me away from what the core goal is, but I could see doing a different project in the future, or maybe something as an outgrowth of this, in which we'd actually print newspaper comics on newsprint, and that could be both public domain, licensed and commissioned work. So one of the things I promised on this live stream was not just to talk at you, but I'm going to show you some artifacts. It'll take just a second to make sure things are set up. But the plan is, here I'm going to be out of view for just a second. You can, here I'll share my happy place here, Charlie Brown and Snoopy dancing. Let me get this set up, but I'm going to show artifacts of printing that I've collected, many different kinds of things that are that have been used across the history of printing, and I can explain things, answer questions as I go. Now give me 1 second. Sorry, it's always, oops. There we go. Okay, we're getting this together so I can share this over Zoom. It's trying to do too many different things here all at once. Very exciting. The joy of a live stream. So this is why you need a producer on events, obviously, is you need somebody who can help you make things work. Okay, so there we go. So now I need to, 1 second, and we'll get this going. Oops. Thank you for your patience. Should connect in a second, and then once it does, there we go. How exciting. Zoom screen. All right, let's get this in place, and then I can show you. I've got a top-down camera here. Say hello to my plant. And so I can show some materials here. No, I'm off. I've got to change the focus of the screen, I think. Oh, will it not show the... That's fascinating. Let's see. Can folks see... Ah, there we go. Okay, you can see it. And I'm trying to keep a microphone near me so you can hear me as well. So I'll show this in just a moment. I'm showing this as a sample here. But the fundamental unit of a comic strip is this, right? It's the cartoon, and that puppy a little better. Here's a classic. It's a Gasoline Alley. This is a 1926 strip, so it's in the public domain. And there's actually some things you can see just directly by looking at the, sorry, this thing is going to fall over here. Just by looking at the at the, beg your pardon, um, looking at the strip close up, you see these dots. Let's see if I can get them a little closer if I pick this up. These dots are actually tell a fascinating story. These are called Ben-Day dots. Now you might think of it as a tone or a halftone screen, something like that, but actually this was made through a very complicated process that's shown in part in this book that I bought off of eBay. It's this incredibly time-consuming process where to apply tints in the metal days, it wasn't just a matter of putting down a tone. It actually, artists had to take an original drawing, they had to paint out the areas that they didn't want to have tone cover. Then they would apply it with I'll show you the picture, they apply it with a roller. These entire room of people here are working on with a special device that let them paint screens and then roll them down to burnish them onto these metal plates, which would then get etched. It was incredibly complicated. So even what seems like a simple comic strip like this Gasoline Alley is actually the result of a lot of industrial process. And I can contrast that just by the way, I'm going to show sizes of comic strips in the book because I think it's really useful to see this change in size. So here we have one comic strip, right? This is one clipped comic from from 1926. That was how it appeared in a newspaper. And here are the Sunday comics from a nearby newspaper that let me go on press with them and watch the paper be printed a couple weeks ago. And these are the Sunday comics. And, this doesn't tell enough of the story because I'm not showing the full newspaper width, but I'm going to show how much comics have shrunk over the years. It's a pretty incredible thing. Here's another interesting, I'm just going through artifacts. And again, please ask questions. If anybody's watching along has questions. So this is an original cartoon. I don't know the artist. I don't even think it's signed. Yeah, I'm not sure the artist's name, but if you can look at this, let's see if I get it closer, it'll show up. It looks like it's just a drawing, right? But you see in the tint areas, there's a pattern. And this is a special kind of paper. It's called craft tint, or there were some competitors. And there was actually a chemical in the paper that had different tint patterns built into it. And it was invisible until you actually used a chemical that you painted over. So artists could actually add a tint to a comic strip, not by laying it down with ink, not by using that Ben-Day process that's very complicated. They could literally paint with a brush in one of two chemicals on some papers and get two different tints. And so that's some of the tint you see here. Artists would work in lots of different ways. So some of the tint you see is like over on the edge is the paper itself with that process being revealed. And this artist also used cross-hatching and other techniques to show darkness. Now let me find, just to contrast, by the way, I was showing that Gasoline Alley a moment ago. So here's the counterpart. Ooh, it's fragile. These old comics, old paper. So if you look at these two elements, this is the bottom. Oops, let me get that centered. So there's the comic itself as printed in the newspaper. This bottom piece is a flong or mat. It's an ad mat, sometimes how it's called, or matrix, and it's a kind of cardboardy substance. It's got wood pulp and other fillers, so it's designed to take a deep impression from a metal plate. And even the dots, you can see again, all the dot pattern is reproduced in this. So the mat here, this flong, is used to cast a metal plate, such as, reach over and bring one of these up. This is a much later comic, so you can see how tiny it is by comparison. Here's a Doonesbury from the 1970s. So you would cast from this flong, you would cast a metal plate at the newspaper, and then there's even more processes that happen after that I discuss in the book. You can download a sample chapter also, by the way, at the Kickstarter campaign. If you go to that URL, you can, it's How Comics Were Made .inc/ks, or go to Kickstarter and search on How Comics Were Made, and you can download a sample chapter that shows this whole older process. Let me pull some of these elements out. I'll show you some other things. Here are flongs, by the way, like newer flongs. You can even see the material used to create these mats. It's really beautiful stuff to hold and touch. It's got this incredible tactile, quality to it, obviously, because it's, it's a real substance. It's not a thin newsprint, but it's actually, so here's a Blondie, there's a what is it, Carrie Drake strip. And so I've collected these over, like, I don't know, many, many decades to talk about. Uh, yeah, Jacob in the comments, and again, please do ask questions in the comments in the chat. Yeah, you just pour molten lead into this, and that's how you get something like this. So these, here's actually very close, is this results from pouring hot lead onto these pieces of paper, which are made of material that's resistant enough, and lead also has a very low melting and boiling point, that you get the result. On to show just one more Flong element here too is, so one of the big questions you may have, a lot of people have, is how comics were printed in color. Uh, actually, I'll oh, I got some questions here. Let me answer these for in a second. For a second here, let me. Hard for me to get back on camera. Oh, you can see me in the corner, so that's okay. Like I say, I don't know how Zoom streaming always works. So the this question in the comments here: how could this process make economic sense? Well, this is the thing. It was the only way this could be done, and newspapers made huge amounts of money, so they could have massive numbers of people employed relatively cheaply, even though a fair amount of union work was, newspaper work was union labor. So when I say cheaply, I don't mean these people were working for pennies, but folks actually made very good money, and the unions enforced very strict rules for working across, they still do in some places, but over, I don't know, since the 1870s or 80s, unions essentially ruled newspapers and typesetting and printing, maybe even a bit before that. So you could have hundreds and hundreds of people in a newspaper plant, from the people in just on the composition side, working linotypes, making the flongs, making all the pieces, running the metal pieces, running the presses. And somehow this made sense because newspapers were a monopoly. They're the only source in town. Even when radio came around, and radio wasn't as effective as the newspaper for selling things, and subscriptions were actually meaningful in those days also. The amount paid for a subscription, because the circulations were so huge, all contributed. So over time, it made economically less sense. Newspapers had less of a role. They brought in less money, still had very high margins, and that was part of the motivation to switch to more efficient typesetting methods that used first CRTs, if you can believe that, and then fully digitized methods, or optical exposure and then digital methods. Jenny, hello, in the comments asked, what was used to emboss the flong? This is a great question, and I have, let's see if I can reach it from here. The process is ridiculous because it's this back and forth generational process. Let me see if I can find, again, this is funny, I've got a small space. 1 second. Well, here, I'll show you a modern example of this, because I had to make this Bill Griffith print I mentioned before, I'm working with a letterpress printer, and so we had a modern plate made, a modern debossing plate made. Now, just because I'm going to be slightly pedantic, it's debossing is when you push down, embossing is when you push up. So these flongs are technically debossed. So you start with original art, like I showed you before. Take a piece of art, and so this is all the metal days, and the process became simpler later. You start with a piece of art, you photograph that, this is in the newspaper plant or the engraving plant, onto a negative. The negative is exposed under very bright light to sensitized zinc plate or a similar metal, and then that sensitized plate is etched. And this is a modern plate that I and Jessica had made for a project. It's a part of a Crazy Cat strip. And so this is a debossing plate. You can see how deep it is. It's used in modern printing and modern production techniques for all kinds of things. So this is made without nearly as much effort as would have been done 100 years ago, because they have modern techniques and automated systems and things. But you can see it has a very deep impression. And then from this, under high pressure, that's how the flongs are made. And so the flongs are debossed, and so you get, for instance, this case, to print the Sunday Funnies, these were 4-color, for most of the last century. Sunday comics are 4-color printing: cyan, yellow, magenta, or red, sometimes called one or the other, cyan or blue. And you'll see the plates are marked with blue and red, not magenta and cyan. And so this is how you would print a single peanut strip from the 1970s, say, in this case. And it's 4 flongs, each of which, so you have black, what is this, labeled somewhere? Usually has a letter, oh yeah, this is yellow, blue, and red. And again, it's fun to look at flongs so you can see the areas that actually need to have a color in different spots. So wherever there's an indentation, so these large areas would have been masked off. Wherever there's an indentation like Linus's head or something, that's what we're looking at here is the red plate. That's just the red portion would get poured into and be raised for printing. And it would all be combined to make a comic. Let's see. Now I'll show, this may be useful to see. So this is a full page flong. I don't know if I can zoom out enough to show you the whole thing here. So this is huge. Actually, it is almost impossible to show you the whole thing, isn't it? This is the an entire page of a comics page at a newspaper, and they would take all those comics that they received from all the different syndicates and so forth. They would lay them out on a page, and then they would make a giant flong like this, because then they would need to make another plate to go on press. And those plates are rounded. They weigh about 40 pounds each. And they went on a cylindrical press, so you could print at high speed. The plates roll, the press is round for all of the printed raised parts, and the paper slides through. They can print incredibly fast. You can see here's a corresponding part. Oh, this is a magnesium plate that would have been made in a later state. This is the 1970s, I think. And this plate is, again, a full comics page. And what it would have been used to do is to make the flong I just showed you. So you'd have laid out a page. I'm sorry, they're saying this wrong. This would have made the flong. So some newspapers would have laid out each comic separately. This newspaper apparently laid all their comics out, maybe even using positive prints. So they would have taken comics from the syndicate as prints that were at the right size, laid them out, and made an entire full page of metal instead of a lot of little pieces, and then made the flong from that. Because the whole goal is to take the cartoon, the illustration, convert it into a form that can be reproduced, and then, so it requires reducing it in size, transmitting it, which means making flongs to send out across the country to newspapers, and then turning those flongs that were received into something that can be printed in the paper and put on a press. And so you have what I count as 7 generations of change to get from just the aspect of an original drawing to the final printed page. 7 generations. And yet, even with all that, you still have a fairly good quality. If you look at older comics, you'll see they're not of a great quality because they were still mastering the process. By the time you get to this flong is, what's the year on this? This is 1951, so relatively a while ago it seems like, but they're using a much more consistent product. There are a few companies that made flong in large quantities or mats, and the product has become very industrial and standardized. And newspapers had sort of figured out the whole process to streamline and preserve the quality of reproduction. Then everything goes through another change because we go to offset printing, and that's a totally different production process. And I happen to have a few materials here I'll show. Jacob asks a couple questions here, and please do ask questions in the comments while you're watching or later. And one comment is, what type of spongy paper is used for the flong? It was a proprietary product made by different flong making companies. There was the Wood Flong Company, confusingly, not called the Wood Flong Company because their flong was made of wood, but the family name was Wood. Yes, I know. There are coincidences in the world. So you can't get flong today. I've tried to find some raw flong that would be available as something I could purchase and study, and I cannot find, despite the amount of material that gets left, kind of the detritus of the past, have not been able to find that. But we found, for doing this zippy print that we're doing, for instance, we found something that is, it's a nice handmade paper that's thick enough that when wet, it takes an impression, so it sort of simulates flong. Oh, and Jacob asked, if you zoom back, you can see this too. The yellow printing, let me see if I can pull that out again. The yellow peanuts printing plate. Say yellow peanuts printing plate 10 times fast while I'm doing this. Uh, so Jacob asks, let's just look at this 1 second. So why are there all these areas that have nothing in them and they're not updented? Well, it seems like, and this is something that I'm still working on understanding, it seems like they would simply fill in those areas. So they would only essentially make plates from the parts they needed to, and they would route out or get rid of the rest because they didn't want to waste the metal. So I believe they just filled that with filling material, with some kind of filler. So all those empty areas, this big ocean of empty space, uh, would be filled in, and only the areas that had actual detail needed to be cast. So I haven't found the technique used for that, and you'd think that'd be mentioned because I found a lot of writing about flongs. So when we get to the modern offset method, what I'm showing here is something, this is on loan from Meg Nash, who is, her father was John Colin Murphy, who took over from Hal Foster, the Prince Valiant strip, and did it for many years after Hal Foster sort of retired from the strip. And the Murphy family, Colin Murphy, Meg's sister, did the writing for the longest time, and Meg did lettering and was the colorist. She marked up all the color. Actually, I can show you. Let's see. One moment. Oh yeah, I'm going to show you the modern flong here in a moment. So a colorist, here's, in the old days, a colorist, this is a shot from a popular science article in the 1940s. This woman is working on, she's taking a print of an original, full, you see the size of the comic she's working on, and using watercolors to mark all of the colors for the different characters and so forth. This would be sent to the syndicate or to an engraving house where they would actually then essentially recreate those colors. So that's how it was done in the metal days. Later, some people would work on, there's a numbering system that was developed, and so cartoonists would mark up numbers corresponding to different colors that could be used. And still later, we switched to digital color, although some cartoonists still use the numbers and syndicates still do some coloring for cartoonists in this old way. So what I want to show here is, so this is in the offset or later eras. This is borrowed from Meg Nash. This is a color separation, and you can see it has different layers for each color. Just go like that. And so each of these, see down there, handle it carefully, combined shows what the colors will look like. And they would get one of these from the printer or the syndicate to check that the color instructions were followed, and if not, they could provide notes. But this reflected a later process in which films were used. These are not films; these are actually proofing films. But these would be made directly from negatives that were made from the colored versions of each of the four newspaper colors, the process colors used to print a strip. So this is a color proof. This is also a color proof, whoops, from 1990. This is a full-page color proof from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And what it is it's like a photographic print practically, made in 4-color. Would have been made to, again, proof the final piece. And to my knowledge, in that era, I think this actually came out, I don't think this was produced digitally. I think this is still a process. It was a good question, though. I think this is still a process where they expose this in a particular way in order to proof it, as opposed to printing it out digitally in color. It was only later that you could get digital prints of this size and quality at a speed that was fast enough. But so this is when you get to we're practically in the final, towards the digital era, where everything is moving towards paper, photographic processes, and light. Well, it's been about a half an hour. Maybe I'll put myself back on camera here and say thank you for your interest. And if anybody have I piqued your interest in terms of, oops, sorry, I've got to, again, confusing to, sorry, trying to be a skilled operator here of the, to get Zoom to actually stop sharing this screen where I'm not seeing the toolbar is on another. This is good. This is what happens when you have multiple screens. The toolbar is actually on another computer somewhere, another computer screen, and I'm actually trying to find it so I can quit. I'll be back 1 second. There we go. As promised, I return. So thanks for tuning in, and thanks for questions, and I hope you'll check out the How Comics Were Made Kickstarter. It's a result of years of work, interviewing dozens of people, trying to show folks what this whole history is about, and tell stories about people. There's a lot of people involved in making comics, and so that includes the cartoonists, but also colorists, letterers, various kinds of assistants in the olden days, and all the people involved in newspaper production and engraving and so forth. There's a lot of unseen labor that I hope to talk about. There's some erasure of people. Trying to highlight stories about sort of not people who are underrepresented in crafts, particularly in the newspaper trade, which was mostly white men for a long part of the history of newspapers. And but there are always people on the sides whose stories are kind of erased because you don't see their photos. So I've been doing the research to make sure we're remembering everybody involved in this process. And I'll be talking about some things that are a little tricky too, like how are people's faces represented. So newsprint media it's kind of a low quality media that favors a lack of color, lack of black. So how, after the age of racist caricatures of people, how are people of color shown in comics when their faces, their skin tones are actually trying to be represented? I've talked to a number of artists about how they consider the issue of facial features and not being a caricature, not be going over into a different area, but also using tone. Talking to the Schultz Museum folks, the Charles M. Schultz Museum in Santa Rosa, they've tracked down, they know the exact day when Charles Schultz switched from coloring Franklin using crosshatched lines to using patterns of dots like Ben-Day dots or tints. And I find that an important part of this story because it's a reproduction story. Is you can't show a black face or a non-white face without, if you're trying to represent it as that, what is that color when you're representing black and white? What are the limitations of the media, and how does the media almost produce a caricature when you don't intend to? So I'll be talking about issues like that and things that are a little more down to earth. I've been calling it kind of highfalutin and lowfalutin at the same time. A last question here. Video Poinky asked, Yellow Kid, was it made specifically because of the color limitations of the time? Other comics leaned into print constraints the same way. There are theories that, and Brian Walker, who is comics historian and part of the Walker Walker Brown empire. So Mort Walker and Dick Brown created separately Beetle Bailey and Hagar the Horrible, which are two of the longest running popular strips of their type, and together they produced High and Lois. Well, those three strips are still produced with members of the I think they're down to third generation. Brian Walker and his brother Greg and some of the Chance Brown, some of the Brown folks, they all work together in different ways, writing the gags, doing the art for those three strips across the two families. But Brian has become, for I guess 50 plus years now, he's been one of the preeminent comics historians, and a collection that he and his father put together and ran as a museum for decades, wound up becoming part of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum in Columbus. And so that International Cartoon Museum, I want to say it's called, that collection is an incredible set of materials gathered painstakingly from cartoonists and from people literally throwing things out for 50 years. And thank God to the Walkers for doing that, or so much of cartoon history would be lost. So Brian Walker has some very specific theories about the Yellow Kid. I hope to do a little more research, but it's hard to know because there's not a lot of reliable information from the 1890s when Yellow Kid was introduced. But it's highly probable the use of color in printing, and then eventually consistently using four color, like full color printing that allowed for color photographs and other kinds of color illustrations. That clearly was an element of why the Yellow Kid was yellow, and color comics were always a big seller as well. It's hard to remember, I think now, quite how important it was to newspapers to have comics. They became sort of denigrated over time, and newspapers would cut them, and then they lose readership because the newspapers were trying to spend less on the syndication fees, take up less space with comics, and there's a point when cartoonists were stars. They were covered in the news media like a movie celebrity, and they were making the equivalent of hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars a year in current dollars. And those days are gone. But I'll talk about some of that. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. Check out the Kickstarter if you're watching this and you've gotten this far after the fact. Please do leave comments here below, or contact me on Mastodon, where I'm at Glenn F, GLENNF, or on other media where you may find me. Thank you and goodbye. Once I